As we begin to look at the major brain areas now, we'll begin with the cerebrum, which makes up about 80% of your brain mass. So it's all of this superior area you see here in the tan color. So this is the origin of all your complex intellectual functions. This is where your intelligence and reasoning happens. Thought, memory, judgment, voluntary movement of your skeletal muscles. When you decide you want to walk, your cerebrum is sending out information to your skeletal muscle. It's also where you have conscious perception of your senses. When you are hearing something, your ears don't know what you're hearing. Your ears simply detect the stimulus, the sound waves, and send it to specific areas of your cerebrum that process it so you know exactly what you're hearing. Same thing with your eyes or your taste, your smell. Your ears, your nose, your eyes, they don't know what they're seeing, hearing, smelling. All they do is detect the information and it goes to the brain. The cerebrum then determines or actually interprets that information and decides if an action is needed further beyond that processing of, oh yes, that's just Miss Nick talking. When you look at the anatomy of the cerebrum, it's very obviously divided into two halves. We call those two halves hemispheres. So you have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Separating the two, you have a very deep longitudinal fissure. You can see the bumps and the bulges, the gyri, bumps, the sulci, the grooves. There is a transverse fissure that we saw previously. Remember, that is between the superior cerebrum and the inferior and posterior cerebellum. And deep within the cerebrum, we have the cavity that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, being those right and left lateral ventricles. We divide the cerebrum into 5 distinct lobes, and they all have their own distinct jobs to do. The frontal lobe is where we have motor control. It processes verbal communication, behavior, conscious thought, and personality. Your parietal lobe has a lot of sensory functions. Your temporal lobe, now think about what's right there, your ear. Well, it should be pretty obvious then. The temporal lobe is responsible for processing hearing, but also smell. Your posterior occipital lobe is for vision and visual memories, and there's a deep lobe that is called the insula that is responsible for memory and taste. As we continue to look at the structural organization of the cerebrum, we've talked about this briefly. Let's go back and look at it again. Remember, the outer area is the cortex. The inner area is the medulla. Now, this outer area is gray matter. The inner area is made up of fiber tracts of myelinated axons. Okay, so that is your central gray area. The fiber tracts connect one brain area to another. And then we have these inner little centers of gray matter. Those are called basal nuclei. Functionally, we divide the brain into functional areas and functional regions. Functional areas include the motor, which causes movement of skeletal muscle, sensory, that receives information, and association makes sense of that incoming information by associating it with something that's already stored in the brain. Functional regions include the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with higher intellectual functions like complex thought, expression of personality, planning, making decisions. And another functional region is Wernicke's or Wernicke's area. I prefer Wernicke because I think it's supposed to be pronounced with a German accent. You tell me if you know better, okay? So this area is found only in the left hemisphere, not on each side as most others are. Now, it is involved in recognizing, understanding, and comprehending spoken and written language. So the Wernicke area and the motor speech area have to work together for communication to occur. So a silly memory trick is Wernicke, or Wernicke, if you want to stay with the W. Wernicke helps us to comprehend words, W and W. The cerebral cortex is sometimes called the conscious mind, and it makes up about 40% of the total brain mass. All of the neurons, now remember, neurons are nerve cells. All of the neurons are interneurons, which means they are in a neuronal pathway, and they are between two or more other neurons. Now, the two hemispheres are symmetrical, but they do have some functional lateralization, which means that one side of the brain may control the total control of something, such as we see with the production and understanding of speech. Here we have Broca's area for producing speech, the motor action of speaking, and Wernicke's area for understanding speech. These are located only in one side of the brain, so that is functional lateralization. However, even though there are things that are handled on one side of the brain, one hemisphere versus another, no functional area acts alone, because the whole cortex has to be involved in those processings and actions. So each hemisphere interacts with the opposite side of the body. We call that contralateral. Contra means against or opposite. Lateral, of course, is side or side. So the right hemisphere interacts with the left side of the body for both getting information, sensory, and motor control, movement. And of course the opposite is true for the left side. The areas of the cortex that control motor functions are within the frontal lobe. We'll begin by looking at the primary motor cortex, which is also called the somatic motor area. So it's located within a structure or an area called the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. The neurons in that area control your voluntary skeletal movement, like when you contract your biceps, or you write notes on your paper, or you walk. So the axons of the neurons there are going to project contralaterally from one side to the opposite within either the brain stem or the spinal cord. So the left primary motor cortex controls the skeletal muscle on the right side of the body, and the right primary motor cortex controls the skeletal muscle on the left side of the body. If you have damage to your primary motor cortex, your voluntary muscles may be paralyzed, but you will still retain the reflex action, as we'll talk about later on, because of the role of the spinal cord. Motor mapping refers to the areas of body regions and how much of the motor cortex is allotted for the movement of that body region. So the body proportion reflects the amount of the cortex that's devoted to that movement. So for instance, if you look at this very strange looking little man here, that is called a homunculus. Now notice how big the tongue is as compared to the pharynx, the throat, or the little finger, the hand, the wrist. Now think about what you move most. Your tongue, you eat, you drink, you swallow. Then you've got a huge face. Your eyes are constantly moving. Your lips and your jaw are constantly moving. Let's go over here. Boy, that hand is big. It's almost as big as the head. But then look at the tiny little torso and shoulder. So what this shows is the bigger the body part, when you lay it across that motor cortex, the bigger the body part, the more of the cortex is allotted to the motor control of that body area. And yes, we'll have another one for sensory in just a bit also. The premotor cortex coordinates with the primary motor cortex, and it's responsible for coordinated movements. Skilled motor activities like moving your eyes when you're reading a book, or playing the guitar, or driving your car, riding a bicycle. If you sustain injury to that area, you'd still be able to understand words when you look at a book. You would still understand how to drive a car or ride a bicycle, but you'd have difficulty in doing so because your body movement would not be determined by that motor cortex. So it's basically, if that gets damaged, you have to relearn the skill because it no longer controls what you have learned. The frontal eye field controls the eye movements that are necessary for looking around, for reading, for coordinating both eyes so that we have binocular vision, which simply means both eyes work together the same way at the same time. Broca's motor area is a motor speech area usually located only in the left hemisphere, and it helps us to put our thoughts into words. So if you wanted to tell me that your dog's name is Sam, so you're thinking, hey Miss Nick, my dog's name is Sam, but because Broca's motor area doesn't work properly to control the motor production of speech, you wouldn't say what you were trying to say. You couldn't produce the vocal aspect of your thought. Now let's take a quick look at some sensory areas. We'll begin with the primary somatosensory. Remember, somato means of the body. Sensory means to bring information in, to detect a stimulus. So this is located in the parietal lobe, and it receives somatosensory information from proprioceptors that monitor position, touch, pressure, pain, and temperature receptors. Now, just like we saw with the homunculus for motor control, this is a homunculus showing us how much of the cortex is allotted for sensory processing. Now look at this. You got a tiny little arm and elbow and trunk and neck. We don't really sense the world with those a lot, but look at this big old hand up here. I mean, if you want to reach out and touch something, what do you use? Your elbow? No, you use your hand. So we process a lot of sensory information, or we have a lot of sensory receptors that get processed by a large area of the primary somatosensory cortex. And again, look over here at the face. Look at that big old mouth, the tongue, as compared to the abdominal organs. I mean, we've got taste receptors here, the mouth, the teeth, the nose, the eyes. This is, again, showing how much of the cortex is allotted for that particular sensation to be processed. Your somatosensory association area associates that incoming information with things that you know, okay? So, for instance, the somatosensory association area allows us to be able to know what we're feeling without looking at it. You put your hand in your pocket, you feel your keys. You know it is your keys. You can tell the difference between a piece of metal and a feather because you know what the feeling is. A smooth round object or a thin flat object, because you know what those are. So you are associating that incoming stimulus with files that your brain has stored. Think about your brain as a computer. You put information in that's sensory and you store it. And then if an action is needed, you send information out. That's what your computer does. You get information on your screen, or you send something to the printer or whatever. The output comes from the input being associated with things that you know. So if you damage your somatosensory area, you may need to learn how to identify those objects again. What do my keys feel like? What is round versus flat? And just a quick look at some of the additional sensory areas. Your primary olfactory cortex is located within the temporal lobe. Olfactory refers to the sense of smell. So it receives, processes, and stores information about different odors. Your primary gustatory cortex is located in the insula. Gustatory refers to taste. So it receives, processes, and stores that information. Your primary visual areas are located in the occipital lobe, and the primary visual cortex receives, processes, and stores the visual information. Well, it's not quite as active yet in the newborn, as the sense of vision is not fully developed. The visual association area integrates and interprets that input based on files our brain has stored. I know when I look at a blue car, it is blue because my brain has stored blue and car. The effects of damage to your visual and auditory areas vary based on how much is damaged and what particular area. Your functional brain regions get information from multiple association areas. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for complex thought, judgment, evaluating whether or not you should do A or B, your personality, your planning, putting things in order, deciding, making decisions. So a lot of what makes you, you, is processed because of that prefrontal cortex. So it allows us to think about things, to make decisions. The prefrontal cortex continues to develop into our teens and early 20s as the axons are going to myelinate in that area, and we remove some of the unnecessary synapses. So as a result, some neuroscientists hypothesize that the reason so many teenagers make bad decisions and are so impulsive is because that prefrontal cortex has not yet fully developed. And as we mentioned, in the left hemisphere, Wernicke's area helps us to recognize, understand, and comprehend both spoken and written language. So if someone is talking to us, we know what they're saying. If we are reading something, we understand what the words are meaning.